Howdy folks, this is Marui of 3BAR-D Videos. And what I have here is kind of a COVID-19 2020 Airsoft project that I've been working on between Reelgun projects. So what it is essentially is I've taken my Tokyo Marui AA-12 and I've successfully converted it to HPA. Now for this video, I'm just going to assume those of you watching this already know what a Tokyo Marui AA-12 is, and you already know what HPA is. So I'm just going to dive straight into the details of why I did this, the various complications I ran into, and how ultimately I did it. So first off, why did I convert my AA-12 over to HPA? One reason is simply to get more FPS for outdoor use, so the gun could be more effective when I go play at some outdoor matches. Another advantage with HPA is that it now gives me the ability to easily adjust my FPS. All I have to do is turn a knob and adjust the hop-ups, and I can have the gun shooting a more moderate FPS for like indoor instead of outdoor. Another great advantage of switching to HPA is you end up with an absolutely superior trigger response in comparison to what the factory offered. And then finally, the number one reason why I did this is simply to gain a heck of a lot more longevity out of the whole gun, opposed to when it was electric. When it was electric, it really did kind of seem like an electric gearbox that was pushed to its absolute limits. You had an extremely powerful spring pushing a polymer piston, probably pretty high grade polymer, but polymer nonetheless, piston with 3 piston rods on the end of it. And it was a lot of apparatus basically that was just pounding away every time you pulled the trigger, and it sounded like it was going to break at any given moment. It never did break, and as far as what I gathered from research online, they last Tokyo Marui makes a great product. They last a long time, but ultimately it seems like a lot of AA-12 owners were eventually suffering from a broken piston. So by switching to HPA, it gets rid of all that mechanism and reduces it down to basically just a nozzle that travels back and forth chambering the BBs. And the amount of, whether you shoot 400 FPS or 200 FPS, it incurs no added strain on the system. So that's the big reason why I went to HPA, is simply for longevity. Now, when I first started the project, there was a few pretty obvious complications I thought I'd run into. And then there's a few that came up later into the project that were less obvious, that I didn't really discover until I got right into it. The first obvious complication that I ran into is the fact that most HPA engines are not going to fit into the gearbox of the AA-12. Even though the AA-12 has like 3 different piston cylinders in it, they're relatively small because each one only has to drive a 300mm barrel, and they're grouped in a way that doesn't really create a huge cavity inside the gearbox. So you have to bust out the Dremel and Dremel away gearbox material in order to get these engines to fit in the factory gearbox housing. This is my discovery anyways. Another obvious problem is the fact that most HPA engines output to 1 nozzle, whereas the AA-12 takes 3 nozzles, or uses 3 nozzles. So you have to find a way to either make a custom nozzle that has 3 nozzles on the end of it, or you could buy an adapter, which I'll talk about later on in the video. And then another complication I ran into that's possibly not really that important is the fact that you may run into insufficient air volume with your HPA system in combination with the AA-12. And what I'm basically getting at here is the AA-12 uses 3 300mm barrels in it. So to put that in perspective, if you combine those, basically that means that your HPA engine has to be able to push a BB down a 900mm long airsoft barrel. So those of you that know anything or into the teching and understand a lot behind the inner workings of airsoft gun, you know that the manufacturers always try to make the compressed air volume adequate for the barrel that they presume the BB is going to be going down. A good example is why a real sword Dragunov has a bigger cylinder than, say, a M4, simply because the real sword Dragunov uses like a very long, like, I forget the length, 600 millimeter barrel. It's the same idea with the AA-12. The AA-12, in theory, should consume or require a huge amount of air volume. So, and your standard HPA engine relies on the volume that's stored upstream of it between the regulator and the engine. So that is your 36-inch HPA line and whatnot. And I don't believe that is quite adequate for the AA-12. So I came up with the solution of putting in this a reservoir upstream of the HPA engine to hold more of that compressed air, which we'll get into later. And then finally, another big complication that is very much important to overcome or to solve, and it isn't exactly obvious when you first start the project, is that the most HPA engines out there do not have adequate nozzle stroke to work with the AA-12. So as far as I've gathered, the AA-12 requires around 400 thou of nozzle travel to function properly, whereas most HPA engines that I've measured offer around 300 thou. So basically you need to find a way to make your HPA engine's nozzle stroke an additional 100 thou in order for it to travel far enough forward to seat against the buckings in the AA-12, but yet retract far enough back to allow BBs to come up from the magazine and be chambered. And the reason for that is simply because, unlike your typical airsoft gun that just fires one BB out of one barrel, where the BB comes up the tube from the magazine and just literally immediately gets shoved straight into the bucking, the AA-12 has to feed 3 BBs into 3 separate buckings. So it needs 3 feed ramps. And of course, those feed ramps add a little bit of standoff in the nozzle travel, to accommodate them. So that's why the AA-12 requires a longer nozzle stroke than your typical airsoft gun. And to overcome this, I custom made a nozzle for the F2 engine that you see here that provides the extra stroke, but I'm going to get into some other options or solutions later on. So to go over the completed thing here, I figured it'd be easiest just to start at the supply, the air supply, and work my way to the barrel and explain everything in between and the various solutions I came up with for those complications in better detail. So starting at the air supply, we got a Ninja 48 cubic inch 3000 psi aluminum tank here with the SLP regulator on it. And then connected to that is a Wolverine Airsoft high pressure storm regulator. And connected to that is an amped Airsoft custom line. It's one of the lines that HPA lines that you can get that's 36 inches long, and you can get different colors put on it. That is connected to the AA-12 via a quick detach fitting right here. I'm not sure what the proper term is for it, but it's just your 1/8 inch national pipe thread fitting, and that is connected to a custom made brass 1/8 inch pipe thread nipple that I made on a lathe. And the only reason why I made this custom is simply to get the perfect length for cosmetic reasons, to have this QD fitting extend just outside the polymer shell of the AA-12, just so it's not protruding out so far and it looks unsightly. That nipple is threaded into a custom made aluminum pressure vessel that I made on the lathe that is there to simply try to offer more air volume to the HPA system to compensate for those 3 barrels of the AA-12. So as you can tell, I designed it to fit inside the pre-existing gearbox of the AA-12, In this case, it's sandwiched inside what would normally house the spring and piston for the AA-12. I would have liked to have made this bigger to hold even more volume, but unfortunately I couldn't figure out a way to do that without starting to lose gearbox parts. And the problem with that is once you start getting rid of the gearbox shells, you're losing the hookup points or the fixture points for the plastic outer body. If you get rid of enough pieces, there's nothing really left to hold the body to the gun or to the gearbox. So this is what I come up with to work with that. I'm not sure how much volume it actually holds, but that's the most I could get. On one end is a brass plug, and then on this end is a 1/4 inch bushing that has a female 1/8 inch pipe thread on it, and threaded into that is, I'm not sure what the proper term is for this, but it's just one of those HPA line quick detach fittings made by Polarstar. And then I believe this is like a 6mm HPA line that I got fitted to it. I cut it down and fit it into it. And this is the line that's included with your Polarstar F2 engine when you buy it. Now, before I move on to the engine, I think I'll cover some of the electrical stuff here. The trigger is mostly stock on this gun. The only mods I did to it is I drilled and tapped a hole in the end of the trigger bar here to thread in a little screw, and that screw is simply put in there to kind of take up the slop between the trigger and the travel of this, I don't know what you'd call this, the sear, the little metal plug thing that shoves into the contacts and closes the circuit and fires the gun. Anyways, I put that screw in there so that way the trigger only has to move so far, like just a little bit before the circuit is closed, whereas before you had to move it quite a ways before it would shoot. Trigger leads come out of there on these 2 wires here. I put in a little electronic, just something I could scrounge from my father's electronic supplies. I just put this little electronic plug on it, so that way it can be taken apart and allow this half of the gearbox to come off and be relatively independent. That goes to a universal circuit board thing that you can buy from Polarstar. The 2 solenoid leads just go into that circuit board. There's nothing changed there. It's how it is. And then for the selector switch, because the AA-12 obviously shoots full auto and semi-auto, I use this little switch thing that you can buy from Wolverine Airsoft as part of their universal wiring kit. And it's a pretty handy little switch. I managed to find a convenient place to screw it to the gearbox, the inside of the gearbox. And how it works is basically the selector on the AA-12, you pivot this arm inside the gearbox, slides to different positions. In this position right now, it is in the full auto. So when it's in that position, it actually pushes this little tab on the switch over, and that basically tells the FCU that the gun is in full auto. It only mounts with 1 screw position, and it had the tendency to pivot on that screw. So to keep it from doing that, I just kind of wedged in some putty epoxy to kind of hold the switch from rotating. That, of course, runs via 2 wires to that universal circuit board that I showed you earlier. Unfortunately, I did run into the complication that the Wolverine Airsoft little switch here comes with a 2mm JST connector, the same connector that's on the end of the solenoids here. However, the freaking board here, provided from Polarstar, uses a smaller JST connector. I think it's like a 1.5mm JST connector. So, and I couldn't find a place that would sell me those without taking forever to ship it to me. So I just opted to pull them off and solder the wires directly to the circuit board. That was the same case for the trigger leads as well. From that circuit board, it's all factory. It just hooks up to the included FCU for the F2 engine via this fancy I don't know, wiring harness. And then that, of course, the battery power to that is done through this, I forget the name of this connector, but it's pretty common for HPA setups. And plugged into that, I have this really nice Gens Ace 800 milliamp hour 7.4 volt LiPo battery. Plugs into that. Oh, I almost forgot to mention, I actually had to relocate this socket on the circuit board from this side to this side. Just by the way, you can see it sits in the gearbox here. I wasn't able to have the room to have all the wires come out one particular way and then this one do like a bend in there and come out the other way, or vice versa. So I had no choice but to unsolder it and solder it on this side, which gave me the proper orientation I needed to make it fit quite nicely in what would normally be the gearbox of the AA-12, where all the gears sit. Now for the HPA engine, to sandwich it in the gearbox, I was pretty barbaric with it, but it's kind of the most effective way I really had to do it. I just dremeled away the aluminum or whatever the heck the material is that this gearbox is made of, some sort of pot metal or something. I just dremeled it away enough to give me the room to fit this in there, and then I assembled the HPA engine together with the nozzle and stuff, which we'll get into in a little bit. I shoved the nozzle into the chamber, I guess we'll call it, of the AA-12 forend here, barrel assembly, in the proper position it has to be in to fire. And then I sandwiched this in the gearbox, bolted it shut, and then I proceeded to mix up the putty JB weld that comes in the putty form, so not like it's like Play-Doh almost, I guess. Yeah, putty's probably the right term. Basically not the two-part epoxy mix that's like almost liquid-like. Yeah, I mixed that up and I shoved it into the gearbox, and I had the HPA engine wrapped in saran wrap so the JB weld wouldn't stick to the HPA engine. And while I was doing that, of course, I was careful to make sure that this was as symmetrical as possible in the gearbox. Like it was perfectly aligned, not crammed to one side or up or down. It's perfectly aligned in the gearbox. And I'll let that cure. And then, of course, once it was all cured, I was able to pull it out, pull the saran wrap off, and test it out, and it fit the engine quite well, but not exactly tight. So I ended up adding 2 layers of electrical tape to the outside edge of the outside of the HPA engine to take up that slack. Now, one thing you gotta be careful about that I learned is you can't cover these holes with the electrical tape, because if you look at the design of how the F2 works, it needs those holes to be unobstructed, or at least some of them. So when nozzles pulled back, the air that it displaces when it's pulled back has somewhere to go, so it gets belched out these little ports here. Now for the nozzle, this is where things start to get a lot more complicated. Originally, when I first attempted this project, I followed Dion Franklin's route, where he went the Wolverine Airsoft way, and he used an Inferno 2 engine, hence why there's so many Wolverine Airsoft parts in this build. I followed his path and attempted to use an Inferno 2 engine in this gun, and that's when I went to finally test it out. That's when I discovered the whole nozzle stroke issue, and to overcome that, I tried to see how I could modify the Inferno 2 to have the added nozzle stroke, and it ultimately became clear that there was too many things, too many fits that had to be changed in order to make it stroke further. So I ended up giving up on the Inferno 2, and I was looking at other possible HPA platforms that would be easier to modify or would offer the stroke that I needed. And that's when I come across another airsoft tech out there that goes by the name of Bryan, and he had mentioned that he used an F2. He didn't give me too many details on what he used, how he managed to pull it off, but he did mention he used F2. So I checked out Polarstar's website, and for the marketing of their F2 engine, they do have conveniently posted a CAD drawing or a SolidWorks drawing of the inner workings of the F2. And I was able to study that long enough and determine that it would be very hard for me to extend the reach of an F2 model with its nozzle. However, it would be really easy to make it retract further back, which ultimately is good enough. As long as, whether it extends further or retracts further, it doesn't matter, as long as it has the added 100th thou of travel. And I determined that I could do that with the F2 by simply modifying 3 different fits on the nozzle assembly in the F2. Originally, I tried modifying a pre-made nozzle that was made for like a SR25 or something like that. It had a really long, it was really long in length. I tried modifying that to retract further back, but I discovered that one of the fits on the outside of the nozzle unfortunately prevented the nozzle from retracting 100 thou deeper into the engine, because if it went too far, the step on the outside of the nozzle here would clear an O-ring that's built into the housing here, and that just wouldn't be good. It wouldn't work. So that forced me to try and produce my own nozzle from scratch, and that is what I did here. With a bunch of machining, I was able to produce my own nozzle that ultimately ended up giving me around 140 thou of travel. And so I plopped this nozzle adapter on the end, which I'm going to talk about shortly here, onto the end of it, and I tried using it in the gun, and I noticed I was getting jams and feeding issues. And what I was realizing is I actually had managed to make the nozzle retract too far back. I was allowing extra BBs to come up into the chamber here, as far as I could tell. So it was chambering trying to chamber 4 BBs instead of just 3. And also the front edge of this adapter here was hooking on some of the gearbox stuff. So I ended up offsetting this nozzle adapter further forward on the custom-made nozzle here, and putting this washer behind it to hold it there, all to simply basically preload the nozzle further back into the HPA engine. Thus, it ultimately reduces the stroke, the overall stroke of the nozzle that I made here. So it's more closer to the 400 thou that's required. And I did that, and that totally solved the feeding issues. The gun feeds 100% reliably now. Now, moving forward, I've been talking a lot about it. This is the nozzle adapter that I'm using. It is once again produced by Wolverine Airsoft. It's a 3D printed nozzle adapter that they sell on special request. You just gotta email them about it. I think I paid around $12 US for it. And how it works is it's simply, it slips over your standard nozzle of like an M4 or something like that, and you take the factory nozzles and nozzle plate from your AA-12 and you bolt it to the front of this thing. Now, oddly enough, this portion right here comes in the shape of a square from the factory, and that does not come anywhere close to fitting in the chamber area of the AA-12 here. So I found that you actually have to Dremel the material away to match up flush with the nozzle plate that's on your AA-12. Because it's 3D printed in a very honeycomb-like pattern for some reason. I don't know if that's to add strength or what. I didn't like the look of that, and I didn't like it, made it look really weak. So I decided to fill that all in with plastic epoxy. So that's why it looks like this. So yeah, that's a pretty critical part that you need, of course, to make this work. I recently got in contact with Polarstar and asked them if they would be interested in producing like a nozzle that would provide me with the stroke that the AA-12 needs, because it'd be so easy for them to do this, in my opinion. Like, it's all produced on a CNC machine. All they gotta do is change some values in the G code, and boom, it cranks, the CNC cranks out a nozzle with those fits adjusted. So I messaged them asking them if they could do such a thing, how much it would cost. And they got back to me saying that they had actually done this before for a bunch of techs in the past, one of which was that Bryan dude. They produced some custom-made nozzles for the F2 engines that provided that stroke and presumably allowed, either had a built-in 3 nozzle setup in it, on it, or it allowed this nozzle plate to be bolted to it. I never asked for a picture. I'm not sure if that's exactly the case, but either way, there's a good chance that you wouldn't need this nozzle adapter from Wolverine if you got the Polarstar one. And the Polarstar told me that they could produce one. They could produce one, or they can produce many. To produce just the one, because the setup time for the machine and stuff, it costs right around $110 US. I think is what they quoted me to do one of them. But if you do multiple ones in one order, with the idea that maybe you're going to modify other people's AA-12s, or you're going to sell them or something, of course, each progressive unit that you add to the order drives the overall cost for all the units down. So yeah, that is pretty much the build in a nutshell. Ultimately, so far I haven't been able to test the system fully yet because it's like -20 outside right now, Celsius, and toy guns and cold weather don't seem to go good together. And unfortunately, due to COVID, all the indoor fields and stuff are closed. So I've just been shooting this around in my house in very close range, like up through a chrono and stuff. And as far as I could tell, at around 160 psi, I am shooting right around 330 FPS, with the hop up just slightly applied, so the BBs don't roll at the front of the freaking barrel. Now, I don't know, maybe I'll get more FPS when I increase the hop ups. I've seen that happen before with this gun. But so far, I'm relatively satisfied with that. That's a heck of a lot more than it was in its factory form. But preferably, I'd like to get it closer to 400 for outdoor use. We'll see how that goes in the future with more testing. I might dare to crank my regulator up to 180 psi if it will allow me, because that Bryan dude messaged me and says he gets like 500 FPS out of his at 180 psi, which I'm not sure how he actually manages to do that, but somehow he says he has. And this FCU is actually really impressive. It's cool how much stuff you can adjust with it compared to the Inferno engine that I was using. I got the gun running on closed bolt right now, so when I pull the trigger, it just simply releases the air to the BBs, fires the BBs, and then chambers the next rounds after that, which results in a much nicer trigger response. This FCU allows you to adjust how long the nozzle retracts back, or how long it takes to retract back, and I believe, and also how long it sits back there before it comes forward. So basically, it allows you to kind of accommodate for how fast the feeding mechanism is on your airsoft gun. In my case, I got those two settings fully maxed out to give those 3 BBs every opportunity they need to travel up the feed ramps and in front of the buckings. I got the rate of fire adjusted to 11 rounds per second, which sounds super slow, but you gotta keep in mind that's 11 shots per second technically with the AA-12. Every time you shoot though, this gun, it's firing 3 BBs. So if you take 11 and times it by 3, you're at that 11 rounds per second actually translates to 33 BBs per second from the AA-12. And the reason why I went with that number is that's what my local field allows for a max rate of fire. So there's no point in exceeding that, right? If I'm going to follow the rules. So that's the fire rate of this. For nozzle dwell, I haven't adjusted that yet. So right now I got it maxed out. So that's something I hope to do in the coming weeks, is adjust the nozzle so it's more efficient. As far as future mods go, depending on whether or not I'm able to eke out more FPS, I may be tempted to buy the Polarstar nozzle, regardless of me having this one successfully work, simply because I am concerned that by having this nozzle pushed in a little bit, preloaded basically, in order to get that feeding issue solved, by the way the F2 works, I'm worried that that produces more spring pressure against the poppet valve or poppet nozzle inside here, and that's maybe not allowing it to fully open and give and dish out the full air pressure or air volume, whatnot, to propel the BBs to their full potential. So I may try ordering that thing regardless, just to, that way the system is absolutely perfect. I may do that in the future. And then other than that, the only other mod I could really think of doing is I do intend to put the PCU AA-12 tracer unit on the end of the muzzle here, because that looks like a really cool unit that's made by that one guy in Romania. Congrats to him for offering a very unique and handy product. So I might place an order of him soon and get that on here and shoot 0.25 grain Griffin tracer BBs out of this gun, because I think that would be pretty cool in the low light conditions of the local indoor fields I play at. So yeah, I hope this video is helpful to those of you out there that are thinking about doing the same to their AA-12s. Now you're more in the loop with what type of stuff you're going to run across and where you could potentially find the parts that you need to get the job done. So until next time, take care and thanks for watching.
Ready?